The Simpsons Road Rage, developed by Radical Entertainment, was released way back in November of 2001 for the Xbox, the PS2, the GameCube, and eventually the Game Boy Advance. A long while ago, I picked up an alpha development tower for the original Xbox. If you don't know what they look like, take a look at this. And if you thought that the retail Xbox was basically a PC, well, you haven't seen anything quite like this. The alpha development tower has the approximate specifications for what the Xbox would become, but more importantly to this video, it held an E3 build of The Simpsons Road Rage. In the time since, I have recovered an alpha build that is in some ways more complete than the E3 build, but in some ways not quite so much. Since that time, the E3 build has miraculously found its way online, but I never really stopped receiving questions about Road Rage. In this video, I want to take a look at these early builds, while I also share some information that I received from the developers themselves. But first, Patreon. We've received a ton of new support this month. GameScrap, Reagan, Cameron, and Chris have all joined in to help support my game preservation efforts. And many of you have also upped your pledge, and for that, I cannot thank all of you enough. If you want early access to videos like this and some exclusive content, do check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/p2ponline. In my research, I first asked about The Simpsons Road Rage's early development. Within the files of various versions of the game, there's a logo for The Simpsons Racing. To me, this showed that the game was first intended to be a racer. But instead, it was actually just a placeholder logo. Early brainstorming between key members of Radical Entertainment focused on the dialogue. After all, that really is what made The Simpsons what it was. But to them, a kart racer would never do, especially since that was the in thing to be making at the time. Simply put, they didn't want to put out yet another kart racer on the market, and instead settled early on of the idea of a taxi-based game.
Can you take me to the quickie
In
mart?
fighting for the Simpsons license, Radical members were told that the other development studios had all seemed to pitch kart racers. It was their taxi proposal that stood out and helped them secure the bid in the first place, along with the help of a playable prototype. Playable prototype pitches weren't all that common at the time. If you think back to Radical's pre-2001 history, they were making mostly sports games, NHL titles of all kind, MTV Sports, and quite a few others. Although it was not immediately seen as such, the loss of these licenses, when Fox Entertainment decided that it was impossible to compete with EA Sports, was lucky in that it allowed them to develop the game prototype. Instead of laying everyone off as many studios would have, Ian Wilkinson, then the CEO of Radical Entertainment, kept everyone on board, having teams create prototypes and pitches. Just as the Simpsons license was acquired in this manner, the Hulk license was also acquired during this time. But let's get back to The Simpsons. At E3 2001, The Simpsons Road Rage was shown running on alpha hardware. The overall layout of the game should be pretty familiar to anyone who's played Road Rage, as very little had changed between it and the retail version. Now, that's not to say that there is no differences at all, but on the surface, things looked pretty much the same. But let's take a deeper look. As we watch a side-by-side view of the E3 build and the final version of the game, you can see that there is at least one huge difference: the graphics, or more specifically, the textures of the world. In the E3 build, the textures are noticeably more cartoony, while the retail build has a bit of a more realistic look to it, at least when you compare the two. I spoke with a handful of developers about this change. One pointed first to the extremely quick development cycle of the game. It has been said that from start to finish, The Simpsons Road Rage took about 11 months to complete, which is still extremely quick, especially when factoring in the new hardware of the GameCube and the PS2 and the Xbox. But that alone couldn't quite explain things. In a follow-up to a rumor that was posted on one of my other Simpsons videos, I asked if Simpsons creator Matt Groening had anything at all to do with this change. To me, the idea would be crazy, especially seeing as though a cartoon style was eventually embraced. But it turns out that Matt Groening didn't think that the world looked 3D enough for a video game. He didn't want the Road Rage game to be a carbon copy of the show, but rather he wanted it to look like a video game. With E3 being in May and the game launching in November, and having to be finished weeks before its release in order to get it actually out on shelves, this meant that the team had to retool and retexture essentially everything over the summer of 2001. So consider this rumor confirmed. Sweeping changes like this led to a new issue. While the new hardware of the Xbox and GameCube were more powerful and easier to work with than the PS2, the PS2 build unfortunately started to have issues in the frame rate department. In the final version of the game, the levels are split into different areas of Springfield, but in the alpha build, it is one huge area. The player could drive from the Simpsons house to just about anywhere else they could have ever dreamed of. But the new textures were giving the PS2 issues. Instead of running at a smooth 60 frames per second, the game would suddenly slow to a crawl. While the programmers did manage to fix the frame rate, yet another issue was introduced. The PS2 just couldn't keep up with some of the more dense levels, and the streaming technology just wasn't there to help. This meant that you could be driving along when all of a sudden there'd be nothing. As you can imagine, this sort of game-breaking bug would never pass certification. With the November deadline fast approaching, the tough decision was made to chop the levels up. In the retail version, you can see just how quickly this was done, with simple props blocking the player's progress into what would have been different zones. All of the developers that I spoke with expressed their dismay at this change. It fundamentally changed the game, and not for the better. But in order to ship the game, it had to be done. Had there been more time, of course they would have focused on fixing this issue first. More time would have also allowed for sub-objectives in the main gameplay modes, instead of the tacked-on mission mode that was in the final game. As for cut characters, while the developers I spoke with couldn't remember exactly why characters like Principal Skinner, Jasper, and others were cut, it is likely to do with time and not other reasons. They were eventually included in the Simpsons Hit and Run, but with 11 months to create this game, it just didn't happen. Road Rage was never seriously a contender to be ported after the recent mobile boom. The team, however, did have PSP development tools, and Hit and Run was briefly considered for the platform, even going as far as having an early prototype working in-house. Sony policies at the time required that PSP games be at least 30% different than their console counterpart, indicating a possible reason why more games weren't ported to the PSP. The Simpsons Road Rage was released to pretty average reviews. Some noted a lack of content and some strange mechanics, mostly due to the handling. This was likely impacted by the quick development cycle of the game. It did do well enough that the previously mentioned sequel, Hit and Run, was developed, and that game did even better. I want to give a special shout out to all the developers who responded back to me, not just on this project, but on other projects I've worked on. Thank you for allowing me to share your stories. I cannot say how much I appreciate all of you. This does wrap up our look into the early development of The Simpsons Road Rage. If you liked it, do hit that subscribe button for the latest and greatest in game preservation news. And of course, do consider checking us out on Patreon at patreon.com/p2ponline. If you're bored, have a look at some of these other games, and until next time, thanks for watching.